He never dared to decide for himself, but always, out of modesty, turned for advice to others, even when he saw more accurately than they did. Louis XV. Johnny Depp played him in his recent film about his mistress, Madame du Barry. Yes, she was the famous mistress and the palace villain we often see in the adaptations of Marie Antoinette. So Louis was the old king when Marie Antoinette entered Versailles and married her husband, Louis XVI. In this video, we're going to go into detail and transform his portraits to see how he might have looked in real life from young to old, and as always, I will talk about his life and what his deal was. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Here on Mortal Faces, I transform historic portraits to see how individuals we read about might have looked in real life, and I also untangle family trees. Lots more on my channel, check out my shop, subscribe for more historic recreations, and let me know in the comments what you want to see in real life. Louis XV, contrary to what a lot of people think, was not the son of Louis XIV, nor was he the grandson. He was actually the great-grandson of Louis XIV. The Sun King, being 72, just lost his son, so his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, became heir. Unfortunately, a year later, in 1712, aged 29, the Duke would also die along with his wife and 5-year-old son, leaving the youngest and third son, Louis, Duke of Anjou, as heir, and the next King of France. As soon as Louis became king, like freshly paved asphalt on the road, cracks appeared. His great-grandfather, Louis XIV, was such a tactician that even after his death, he kept on going. It's a long story, but I'll go fast. In his will, he wanted his illegitimate son from Madame de Montespan to rule, but he couldn't. So his nephew, the son of his brother, Philippe II, Duc d'Orléans, became regent. He was untrustworthy, so Louis XIV instead made the regent into a council where Philippe II was president, but Montespan's son was a member with his friends. This means Montespan's son could always overrule Philippe. Philippe saw this trap, went to Parliament where his friends were, and because they were the only ones allowed to overturn some of the king's will, they agreed to make him sole regent in return for the power to challenge the king. This law, super important by the way, because it would impair the monarchy's function and begin the conflict between king and parliament, which would contribute to the French Revolution in 1789. The latter part of his regency was peaceful though. He was taught Latin, Italian, history, geography, astronomy, math, drawing, cartography, court etiquette. He was taught how to review a regiment and how to receive royal visitors. You see, he received a very practical education in government, attending regular political meetings even though he was still a kid. And as a result of this peace during this time, the Age of Enlightenment in France quietly began. 1723. He was 13, and the regency ended. One of his first priorities was to find a bride. 99 princesses were prepared, from Great Britain to Denmark and Portugal. Even his own French cousins were eligible. In the end, he chose Princess Marie Leszczyńska of Poland. He was 15 and she 22. It was 1725, and they fell in love instantly. She became quite popular, introducing Polish customs to the court of Versailles. They produced 10 children, 8 girls and 2 boys. Of the 2 boys, the eldest is the only one to survive childhood. Enter Cardinal Fleury, the king's old tutor. He was the one who taught Louis about math, science, technology, history, and geography while he was a child. He gained the trust of Louis so much that when his current prime minister and cousin, the Duke of Bourbon, became too much for Louis, he was essentially replaced by Fleury. On the surface, it was the most peaceful and prosperous period of the reign of Louis XV, but it was built upon a growing volcano of opposition, particularly from the noble members of Parliament who saw their privileges and powers reduced. You see, Fleury forbade much debate in Parliament, which saw silent opposition grow, and he downplayed the importance of the French Navy, which proved fatal in future conflicts. Yet his glory was showing Louis the virtues of a stable and quiet government. Fleury's government expanded commerce, transportation, shipping, and the road network. By the middle of the 18th century, France had the most modern and extensive road networks in the world. Fleury basically did a lot of good for France, but at the same time buried and ignored a lot of the bad. He didn't want to hear or discuss anything overly negative, only shine light on the good, a crime which would slowly cause the political climate to heat up. But then he dies during the War of the Austrian Succession. Louis was 33, and this was one of two big wars that Louis ends up fighting. The War of the Austrian Succession between 1740 to 48 was a challenging war and began France's decline in finances. But we get to see Louis's opinion on war. He told his son after a victory, "You see what victory costs. The blood of our enemies is still the blood of men. The true glory is to spare it." After Fleury's death, Louis saw a letter from Louis XIV that counseled, "God who made you king will give you all the guidance you need, as long as you have good intentions." Louis followed his advice, probably too much, as he had all good intentions, but lacked fear in his command. With the end of the war, Louis decided to take the opportunity to reduce the debt and modernize the system of taxation for the kingdom, which would be a thorn in his behind for the rest of his life. Mistresses. Louis loved women. He started with the de Marie sisters. Louis was in love with the queen, but she was constantly pregnant and exhausted by her maternities, so he began to look elsewhere. He attached himself to Louise Julie de Marie, the eldest of the de Marie sisters, and was the same age as him. Then, Louis took attraction to her second sister Pauline, but she died giving birth to his son. Louise then introduced her youngest sister Marie-Anne to Louis. Marie-Anne insisted that he expel Louise before she became his mistress, which he did. Marie-Anne became the most powerful of the de Marie sisters at court. Marie-Anne lasted 2 years until she died, and then the king consoled with her other sister, Diane, and lasted only a few months until he dropped her for Madame de Pompadour. I have a separate video on her success as the royal mistress, but she became the most successful mistress, and even after, his closest advisor and companion until her death. She has a very interesting story lasting 19 years with a king. After her death, Louis mourned and locked himself away for weeks, but then he met Madame du Barry, his last mistress until his death. I also have a separate video on her portrait recreations. She is often portrayed as the villainous mistress when Marie Antoinette arrives at Versailles. Enter the 7-Year War. From the mid-1750s to 1763, Britain declares war on France. It was a battle of who will get world domination. France loses. Not only did France support itself, but also its allies financially. So France lost all that money, and it was a huge debt that added onto the debt from the previous War of the Austrian Succession. So the uneasiness of France is starting to teeter and totter by this point. In order to pay off his deficits, Louis wanted to tax everyone equally, including the nobles who were previously exempt. Because of this, some parliament members went on strike, and Louis had to suspend quite a few prominent people. And it's this internal strife that opens a rift between the relationship of parliament and the king, which leads to the opening of the French Revolution. With the rift now open, and the ingredients of no money, taxes on everyone, including the nobles, and the ability to challenge the king, the gash has been made. But quietly, infection, you see, hasn't started yet. It's the 1760s, Louis now in his 50s, and his personal life was not getting better. Madame de Pompadour died, his son died, and the queen died. Parliament is still giving him a headache. All he wants is peace, like his early years of the reign with Cardinal Fleury. But it's that stinking law that allows Parliament to challenge the king that creates such a headache. As a result, wealthy bureaucrats are divided by the king. And then you have the grain issue. Up until now, the agricultural market was strictly controlled, but with this new age of enlightenment, people wanted to open it up, so it's a free market. Sounds good, right? Well, in good years, yes. Everything is peachy, but in bad years, unfavorable harvests like in 1766, 67, and 68, prices go up. 3 consecutive years of bad harvests means high prices on grain, and now the poor people are blaming the king, thinking that he is the one who's starving them, as he lives so good in Versailles, but we all know from my previous video, Versailles is not that peachy. At this point, Louis was fed up with the parliaments not listening, and who were on virtual strike, so he basically created a small group called the Triumvirat to take charge of the government and put everyone who was undermining his authority fired and sent home. This seemed to work until his death. Louis died in 1774, aged 64 from smallpox. After his death, his grandson Louis XVI took the throne with Marie Antoinette, and the bureaucrats who were expelled now wanted their powers back. Unfortunately for the monarchy, Louis XVI wasn't exactly trained in authority, rather to be a puppet to his ministers. Louis XIV had been too proud, but Louis XV was not proud enough. Other than his excessive modesty, his great and sole vice was women. He believed that only his mistresses loved him enough to tell him the truth. For that reason, he allowed them to lead him, which contributed to his failure with finance, which was the worst aspect of his reign. And that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more recreations, I have it on Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, as well as many more. You can check them out on my channel. Subscribe for more recreations. Each of your subscriptions does help the channel grow. It allows me to continue making more content for you. Let me know in the comments who you want to see next. In real life, I do make a list of all your suggestions, and I will see you in the next one.